prince who turned nightmares into weapons. The real story of Vlad the Impaler. Summer 1462. Imagine the sun just beating down on the biggest column of soldiers Europe had seen in a lifetime. This was the Ottoman army, the guys who had just taken Constantinople, who had been knocking down empires on 3 different continents, and now they were marching into this tiny little place called Wallachia like they owned it, because, well, they usually did. Sultan Mehmed II, not even 30 years old, and they're already calling him the Conqueror, is leading more than 90,000 of the baddest men on the planet. Behind him, for miles, you've got the best soldiers, the best cavalry, the best engineers in the world, carrying the newest firearms and decked out in the finest armor, with enough supplies to just sit there for months. This wasn't an army showing up for a fight. This was an army showing up to move in. They figured it'd be a cakewalk, a quick little campaign, maybe a few minor tussles before the local prince just rolled over. But what they were about to walk into? It was something that would crawl into their deepest, darkest nightmares and stay there for generations, completely rewriting the rules of war itself. The first thing that hit them wasn't a volley of arrows. It was a smell. It rode in on the summer breeze and it hit them like a fist to the gut. The stench of death, of pure decay, and something else. Something so foul it had no name. Something that made battle-hardened warriors who'd seen the absolute worst of siege warfare gag and shield their faces. We're talking about veterans who stormed the walls of Constantinople, men who had waded through rivers of blood at Kosovo, and they were literally on their knees, retching. As the Sultan's column crested the hill just outside the capital Targovist, the whole army just stopped, froze solid. The scouts up front were like statues, unable, or maybe just unwilling to take another step. At first glance, it looked like a forest stretching out before them. But as their eyes adjusted, as their minds desperately tried to reject what they were seeing, the horrifying truth crashed down on them. Those weren't trees. They were standing before a forest of the dead, a meticulously crafted monument to human suffering on a scale that shattered the very notion of sanity. 20,000 bodies, each one skewered on a wooden stake, arranged in perfect geometric rows that disappeared into the horizon, laid out with the cold precision of a parade ground formation. The stakes were all different heights, creating this grotesque undulating canopy of death. Some of the bodies had been out there for weeks, bloated and blackened by the relentless sun, their faces melted away into unrecognizable masks of pure rot, a feast for the crows that picked at the flesh. Others were fresher, their forms still intact, still tragically recognizable as the men they had been just days ago. And the worst part, the part that broke them all, was that some of them were still moving, still breathing, still screaming their collective voices, weaving a symphony of pure agony that you could hear for miles. They cried out in Turkish, in Bulgarian, in Greek, begging for water, for a merciful end, for anything at all to stop the torment. The Sultan, the man who brought the Byzantine Empire to its knees, took one long look at that scene and ordered his entire army to turn back. In that one silent moment, a single prince ruling a chunk of land smaller than West Virginia had just defeated the most powerful empire on earth without firing a single shot. His name was Vlad Dracula, and his story, man, it tells you something truly terrifying about what we're all capable of. Look, Vlad wasn't born a monster. He was meticulously crafted by one. Back in 1442, when Vlad was just a kid, only 11 years old, his own father cut a deal with the devil himself, Sultan Mehmed II. The deal was simple. Vlad Dracul, the ruler of Wallachia, got to keep his throne. The price he handed over his 2 youngest sons, Vlad and his little brother Radu, as political collateral. Just like that, they were ripped from their home and shipped straight into the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Now they weren't tossed into some dark, damp dungeon. That would have been too easy, too unsophisticated. The Ottomans had a much more refined approach. Instead, young Vlad and Radu were wrapped in silk and brocade, taught by the best scholars, and trained in the art of war by legendary generals. They lived in opulent palaces, surrounded by a level of luxury they could only have dreamed of back home. They learned to speak Turkish so fluently they sounded like natives. They studied the poetry of Arabia, they debated philosophy, and they even memorized whole passages from the Quran. They were given a front-row seat to the inner workings of an empire, learning military strategy from the men who were conquering the world, and courtly deception from the absolute masters of the game. On the surface, it looked like a golden opportunity, a real honor. You see, foreign princes who got this kind of education at the Sultan's court usually went back home as loyal puppets, grateful for the experience and totally ready to serve Ottoman interests. But for Vlad, this was something else entirely. It was a slow, creeping poison. This was psychological warfare honed to a razor's edge, and he was the living canvas for their masterpiece of manipulation. Just try to put yourself in his shoes for a second. You're 11 years old. You've been torn away from everything you've ever known and handed over to your people's most hated enemy. You're surrounded by all this insane luxury, but you know deep down that your own father traded you for power. You have to watch your little brother just fit in, even thrive in this environment, while you're filled with this burning defiance you can't let go of. You live every single day knowing that your life is hanging by a thread, that if your father steps out of line, you're the one who's going to pay the ultimate price. You have to understand you weren't a guest, and you weren't really a student. You were insurance, a living, breathing contract written in flesh and blood. While his younger brother Radu just soaked it all in, becoming a pro at navigating the snake pit of Ottoman politics, even getting tight with Prince Mehmed, the future Sultan Vlad just refused to break. But he did something way more dangerous. He watched. He learned. He studied with a cold fascination how the Ottomans used fear, not as a blunt instrument of rage, but as a scalpel, a calculated tool of statecraft. He saw public spectacles designed not just to end a life, but to scar the minds of entire populations, to create examples so horrifying that cities would surrender without a fight, rather than face that kind of wrath. He saw firsthand how terror, when applied with surgical precision, could be a weapon far more powerful than any army. Ottoman records tell us Vlad was punished, and punished often, for his rebellious spirit. What exactly they did to him has been lost to time, but something inside that young prince snapped during those 6 years. Or maybe it didn't snap. Maybe it was forged into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous than his captors could ever have dreamed. Every moment of pain he was forced to endure, he analyzed. Every new method of execution he was made to witness, he committed to memory. He was building an encyclopedia of cruelty in his mind, piece by bloody piece, stockpiling the very tactics that would one day be turned back on the empire that taught them to him. And through it all, one single, all-consuming obsession began to grow in his mind: control. Absolute, unbreakable control, because for 6 long years he had none at all. In 1448, after 6 years as a prisoner in everything but name, a 17-year-old Vlad was finally sent back to Wallachia. 2 months later, his father was assassinated by his own nobles. His older brother Mircea was captured by those same men, blinded and buried alive. Just like that, Vlad was completely alone, surrounded on all sides by enemies, with no one to back his play. The ruling class of Wallachia, the boyars, were professional turncoats, constantly switching their loyalty between the Ottomans and the Hungarians, whoever offered the better deal. Betrayal wasn't just a risk, it was the entire system. Now most people in that spot would have bolted. They would have run hid, begged a foreign king for protection. Vlad did the exact opposite. With a little help from the Ottomans, he managed to grab the throne for a hot minute, only to get kicked out a few months later. He then spent the next 8 years in exile, a ghost in the political wilderness, just planning, waiting, and watching. And when he finally clawed his way back to power in 1456, he came with a plan so brutal and so effective that history would never ever forget his name. Vlad understood a fundamental truth, that his enemies just didn't get something the Ottomans had inadvertently taught him during those 6 years of hell. Fear is a form of currency, maybe the most powerful currency, in the brutal game of medieval politics. And he was about to make himself the richest man in all of Europe. But first he had to settle a score with the boyars, the so-called noble families, who had murdered his father and brother, the ones who had betrayed his family and sold off pieces of Wallachia to the highest bidder for years. On Easter Sunday, 1459 a day, meant to celebrate resurrection and new beginnings in the Christian faith. Vlad invited all the top noble families to a grand feast at his palace in Targovist. It was an invitation you just couldn't turn down. To say no would be a massive insult to the new prince, a clear signal of disloyalty. So they all showed up, hundreds of them, decked out in their most expensive clothes, dripping with gold and jewels, shamelessly flaunting the wealth they'd built on decades of backstabbing and betrayal. They brought their wives, their kids, their whole entourage. The feast was incredible. I mean, tables were literally groaning under the weight of roasted game-fresh bread, the finest imported wines and delicacies from all over the continent. There was music servants gliding through the halls, and the boyars were getting comfortable, patting themselves on the back for their clever politics, already whispering and scheming about how they were going to manipulate this young prince, just like they'd handled his father. Then after the main course, as his guests were kicking back full and happy, with their minds softened by wine as the afternoon sun slanted through the palace windows, Vlad gave a quiet signal. Suddenly guards materialized at every doorway, sealing the great hall. These were not the palace guards. These were heavily armed men fiercely loyal to Vlad and Vlad, alone men with zero ties to the noble families, men who would follow any order without blinking. The laughter in the hall died. The music screeched to a halt, and in the dead silence that followed, Vlad stood up. The older nobles, the ones who had actually been there, the ones who had a hand in his father's murder, who held the knife or gave the order, or just stood by and watched as Vlad Dracul bled out, were called out, one by one. They were dragged outside, still dressed in their fancy Easter clothes and impaled on the spot, right outside the palace walls, for the entire city to see. Their screams tore through the capital as sharpened stakes were driven up through their bodies as they were hoisted into the air to die a slow, agonizing death that could last for hours or even days. But the younger ones, the sons and grandsons, who had simply reaped the rewards of the crime, who had inherited their power and position from that ultimate act of betrayal, they got a different kind of sentence. Vlad forced them on a death march, still in their fine silks and velvets, a grueling 50-mile trek north into the Carpathian Mountains, to the crumbling ruins of Poenari Castle. There he worked them like animals, forcing them to haul massive stones and mix mortar, rebuilding his fortress with their bare hands. Their expensive clothes were reduced to rags. Their soft, privileged hands blistered, bled, and broke. They dropped dead by the hundreds from exhaustion, from the cold, from accidents. But Vlad didn't give a damn. He wanted that castle rebuilt, and he wanted it built with the sweat, blood, and bones of the very families who had torn his own apart. By the time Poenari Castle stood strong again, the old boyar class was gone, effectively erased. Their power shattered. Their fortune and seized their influence, extinguished forever. But Vlad wasn't just getting rid of his enemies. He was crafting a message that would thunder across the continent. When a group of Italian merchants wouldn't take their hats off for him, saying it was their custom, Vlad had their hats nailed directly to their skulls. When Saxon merchants in Transylvania started complaining about his new trade rules, he had hundreds of them impaled in the middle of their own town square. When he even suspected the people of the city of Brasov of being disloyal, he put so many of them on stakes that the locals started calling the area the Forest of the Impaled. And the impalement itself, you have to understand, it wasn't just random savage violence. Vlad had turned it into a horrifying, precise science. The stake couldn't be sharp. It had to be rounded and well-oiled. A sharp point would kill you way too fast. The victim was forced down onto the stake, which was then carefully guided through the torso, meticulously avoiding the vital organs to prolong the process. Then the stake was raised upright and planted in the ground. If the executioner did his job right, a person could hang there for days, slowly dying from shock, from thirst, from infection, all while the birds came to peck at their living flesh. Vlad didn't try to hide these horrors. He arranged them in neat geometric patterns, like a garden, making sure they were impossible to miss. He would famously hold feasts, right in the middle of these forests of the dying, supposedly enjoying his meal, as blood dripped down around him. The stories started to spread like wildfire whispers that he would dip his bread in the blood of his victims. Whether that part was true or not, we'll never know, but Vlad did absolutely nothing to deny the rumors. In fact, he encouraged them, because every single impalement, every public execution, every carefully crafted rumor about his own depravity, it all served a cold, strategic purpose. Vlad was writing a message in blood, a message that could be read from the capitals of Europe to the heart of the Ottoman Empire. This little strip of land, this principality caught between two worlds, was defended by a man who had no limits, no rules, and no mercy. If you came for him, there would be no honorable combat, no prisoners of war, no quarter given. There would only be a world of unimaginable suffering waiting for you. That message was received loud and clear in Constantinople. By 1462, Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of empires, decided he'd had enough. He gathered an army of over 90,000 men, a force that outnumbered Vlad's entire military at least 10-1. This wasn't planned as a battle. This was pest control. It was meant to be an extermination. Vlad knew he couldn't win a straight-up fight. It would be suicide. So he didn't fight one. As Mehmed's colossal army pushed into Wallachia, Vlad's smaller forces just seemed to vanish, melting away into the deep forests and rugged mountains. What the Ottomans found was a wasteland, a scorched earth. Every well was poisoned, every crop was burned to the ground, every village was a ghost town, all the livestock had been slaughtered and left to rot in the fields. For hundreds of miles, every single source of food and water had been systematically and utterly destroyed. The Ottoman army kept pushing forward, but a deep sense of unease was starting to set in, and that's when the night terrors began. Small phantom-like groups of Vlad's men would materialize out of the darkness, striking the massive Ottoman camp, slitting throats in the dead of night, and then disappearing back into the shadows before anyone even knew what was happening. They contaminated the few remaining water sources. They launched diseased corpses over the camp walls with catapults to spread sickness. They even dressed in Ottoman uniforms to infiltrate the lines and cause chaos, making the invaders look at the man standing next to them and wonder if he was a friend or a demon in disguise. Mehmed, furious, pushed his army deeper and deeper into Wallachia, hell-bent on crushing this phantom menace. And that is when he finally came face to face with the forest of the impaled. The exact body count changes depending on who's telling the story, but most historians agree it was at least 20,000 corpses, maybe even more. And you have to get this. These weren't Wallachian peasants. These were Ottoman soldiers and Turkish civilians, prisoners taken in earlier raids, all perfectly preserved in this single, monumental display of absolute horror. The Sultan stopped his army cold. For 3 whole days his men camped in the shadow of that forest of death, while Mehmed tried to figure out his next move. His soldiers, these were the men who had conquered half the known world, and they were utterly terrified. Morale didn't just drop, it evaporated. Disease was now ripping through the camp, and then Vlad delivered the final psychological blow. On the night of June 17th, 1462, Vlad launched his masterpiece, an attack so unbelievably audacious that military strategists still study it to this day. He had spent weeks gathering intel on the Ottoman camp, using a network of spies, interrogating prisoners, sending out scouts, anyone who could give him a piece of the puzzle. He knew exactly where Mehmed's tent was, where the high-ranking officers slept, where the supply depots, where the guard rotations, every single weakness. He had studied their routine so obsessively that he probably knew that camp better than the Ottomans did themselves. As the sun bled out on that June night, Vlad himself, in the flesh, led a strike force of 10,000 souls, every single warrior hand-picked, every one of them ready to cash it all in for their prince. They slid through the blackness like specters, calling on every dirty trick Vlad had ever learned in his long years of shadow warfare. They flew stolen Ottoman flags. They wore the uniforms stripped from the enemy's dead. They had mastered the Ottoman war cries, their commands, their very formations becoming a perfect mirror of the army they meant to break. This move, which history would call the night attack of Targovist, turned the Ottoman camp into a living nightmare. Vlad's men ripped through the enemy lines like a buzzsaw, through paper dropping thousands, before anyone even knew what was hitting them. In the pitch black, with soldiers in Ottoman gear, screaming in Turkish, and using their own tactics against them, the camp just imploded into a paranoid hellscape. Ottoman soldiers started fighting other Ottoman soldiers with no clue who was friend or foe. Officers were yelling orders that made no sense. Whole units were firing on their own men. The entire massive 90,000-strong army just dissolved into pure, shrieking terror. And Vlad himself, they say, led the charge, straight for Mehmed's tent, his blade, slick and red, cutting a path through anyone who stood in his way. Some stories claim he got within arm's reach of the Sultan himself before the Janissaries, the elite guard, finally got their act together and threw up a defensive wall around their leader. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, the darkness lit by the eerie glow of burning tents, the air so thick with smoke and screams and the ringing of steel that you could barely breathe. By the time the sun came up, when Vlad's forces finally melted back into the forests, they left behind an absolute slaughterhouse. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead killed, as often by friendly fire as by a Wallachian sword. The camp was a wreck. Supply wagons were still burning, horses ran wild, and officers were either dead or had vanished into the chaos. But the real damage, the deep-down wound, was psychological. An army that had never known what it felt to be scared now knew nothing else. The Sultan made it out alive, sure, but a piece of the Ottoman army's soul died that night. They'd stared death in the face before. They'd toppled empires. But this was something else entirely. This was a war with no rulebook, fought by a man who seemed to be born from the darkness and chaos itself. Mehmed gave the order. A retreat. The mighty Ottoman army, an unstoppable force that had never been turned back by an enemy so small, was leaving Wallachia with its tail between its legs. Vlad had done it. He'd won. Against odds that were just insane, using nothing but pure weaponized terror and guerrilla warfare, he had saved his tiny kingdom from the biggest empire on the planet. He should have been the toast of Christian Europe. They should have buried him in gold and soldiers and support. But instead, what happened next showed everyone the poison that came with his cure. Because you see, Vlad couldn't just turn it off. The war was over. The Ottomans were gone. The threat was neutralized. But the methods were all he had left. The weapon he had so carefully crafted to beat a bigger enemy, this blade of calculated terror, had become the only tool in his toolbox. The impalements didn't stop. In fact, they sped up. Only now the stakes were for his own people, for the very men and women he had just fought tooth and nail to protect. And the pattern was always the same, just chillingly predictable. Someone would step out of line, or he'd just imagine they did. A merchant who jacked up his prices by a few pennies. A beggar who wouldn't work, maybe couldn't work because he was old or broken, but refused all the same. A woman accused of cheating by a jealous neighbor. A guy who bad-mouthed Vlad's policies in what he thought was a private chat. The sick who couldn't give back to society. The poor who needed a handout. Anyone Vlad decided was corrupt or weak or disloyal or just unnecessary found their story ending on the point of a stake. There's this one story from that time, a real spine-chiller, that might just be a legend cooked up by his enemies, but it tells you something vital, whether it's true or not. Vlad, the story goes, ordered all the sick, the poor, and the disabled in Wallachia to come to a huge hall for a grand feast. They came in the thousands, limping, crawling, carried in on the backs of family, all of them thinking they were about to get a good meal, that their prince had finally seen their suffering. And the feast was real. The tables were groaning with food. Wine was poured like water. The poor and the sick ate their fill for what was probably the first time in years. And then Vlad showed up. He asked them a simple question. Would you like to be free from all your worries, from all your pain, from all your hunger? And of course they all screamed yes. They cheered for him. They praised his name. Vlad just smiled, walked out of the hall and ordered the doors bolted shut from the outside. Then he had the entire building set on fire. As the legend tells it, Vlad just stood there and watched as the hall went up in flames, as the screams of hundreds of his people clawed at the night sky, as the poorest and most vulnerable of his subjects died in pure agony. His logic, according to the accounts, was that they were a drain on the state, just mouths to feed, that produced nothing, that they were honestly better off dead, and Wallachia was better off without them. Now, whether that happened exactly like that is up for debate. But what isn't debatable is that Vlad's terror had turned inward, like a cancer eating his own country alive, destroying the very thing he'd sworn to protect. And politically his position was crumbling fast. His own brother Radu, bankrolled by the Ottomans, was suddenly looking like the sane choice. His Hungarian allies backed away, totally creeped out by his behavior. The same terror tactics that broke the Ottomans had now left him completely alone on the world stage. By November of 1462, just a few short months after his greatest victory, Vlad was on the run, forced to flee into Hungary, and in the most bitter twist of fate, he was arrested and thrown in prison by his supposed ally, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. The official charges are still pretty murky. Some historians think Matthias faked letters to frame Vlad, making it look like he was cutting a deal with the Ottomans. Others figure Vlad had just become such a loose cannon that even his Christian allies wanted him gone. Vlad spent the next 12 years as a prisoner in Hungary. It wasn't like the brutal captivity of his youth. This was more like a comfortable house arrest. He even married a Hungarian noblewoman and started a new family. And by all accounts, he played the part of the perfect prisoner, turning on the charm when he had to, always playing the long game of survival that had been beaten into him as a boy. Then in 1476, his chance came. Wallachia had fallen into chaos under a string of weak leaders, and Moldavia's prince, a guy named Stephen the Great, helped pull the strings to get Vlad back on the throne. Backed by Hungarian and Moldavian soldiers, Vlad stormed back into Wallachia and took his crown back in November of 1476. He ruled for maybe 2 months. Sometime in December of 1476, or January of 1477, the exact date is lost to the fog of time, Vlad was killed in a battle with an Ottoman army near Bucharest. How it happened is still a mystery. Some say his own men cut him down either because they betrayed him or because they mistook him for an Ottoman in the chaos of the fight. Others say he was just finally overwhelmed by enemy soldiers. What we know for sure is what happened next. His head was hacked off, preserved in a jar of honey, and shipped to Sultan Mehmed in Constantinople as proof that the monster was finally dead. After all of it, the terror, the forest of bodies, the psychological warfare that broke an empire's mind. Vlad ended his days as a trophy displayed in the capital of the very enemy he had spent his entire life trying to destroy. They say his body was buried at Snagov Monastery on a little island in Romania. But when archaeologists dug up the tomb in the 1930s, they found it empty. To this day, nobody has a clue where Vlad's remains actually are. And maybe that's the perfect ending for him. The man who was a master at making people vanish in the end, vanished himself. So what's the final verdict on Vlad the Impaler? Look, the question itself is a trap, because there's no easy answer, no clean conclusion that lets you file him away as good or evil and just move on. In Romania, he's often held up as a national hero, a savage, yeah, but an effective leader who stood up against impossible odds and kept his country free when all logic said it should have been swallowed whole. You'll see statues of him in town squares. His face is on t-shirts, postcards, even restaurant menus. Kids learn about him in school, not as a monster, but as a defender of the nation. Politicians invoke his name as a symbol of strength, of refusing to bow to foreign powers. For a lot of Romanians, the impalements, the terror, all of it. It was a necessary evil. It was the horrific price they had to pay to survive. But to the rest of the world, especially after Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula loosely borrowed his name and a few scraps of his story, Vlad became something else. He became synonymous with vampires and supernatural evil, morphing from a complex historical figure into a gothic horror icon. The real Vlad got buried under the fictional vampire, and in a way that's easier for everyone. It lets us turn him into something not quite human, something other, something we can safely label a monster and not have to think too hard about. But calling him a vampire, a monster, something inhuman, man, that's the easy way out. It's a comforting lie that lets us dodge the uncomfortable truth staring right back at us from the pages of history. Everything Vlad did was human, painfully, terrifyingly human. Every single choice he made, every atrocity he signed off on, every calculated act of pure terror. These were the decisions of a human being using human logic inside a very human system. He wasn't born evil. He wasn't spawned from some dark pit or possessed by a demon. He was built piece by piece, deliberately, by a system that taught him one lesson: above all others, power grows from the barrel of a gun, or in his case, from the point of a stake. It taught him that survival demands absolute ruthlessness, and that empathy is a weakness that will get you killed. His education started when he was 11 years old. It was over when he was 17. And in those years between, he learned things that most of us, thank God, will never have to learn: lessons about what really happens to the weak, about how power actually works behind the curtain, about the cold mechanics of domination and fear. And he took those lessons and pushed them to their absolute logical conclusion. He stripped away all the polite fiction and hypocrisy that most rulers hide behind, and applied terror with a purity of purpose that was almost scientific. The Forest of the Impaled wasn't some fit of madness or random cruelty. It was applied psychology 101, a carefully crafted message written in human flesh and blood that you could read from miles away. The night attacks weren't just mindless violence. They were precision strikes designed to cause maximum psychological damage with minimum actual fighting. Every impalement, every mutilation, every public spectacle of suffering was a calculated move on a much larger chessboard, a move designed to protect a tiny nation from enemies that outnumbered it 10 to 1, or even more. And here's the part that should really mess with you, the part that should keep you up at night. Thinking about what it all means, it worked. Against all odds, using nothing but weaponized fear and his own brilliant, twisted mind, Vlad turned back an empire. He proved that terror, when it's properly aimed and applied with surgical precision, could do what conventional armies couldn't. A force of 10,000 beat 90,000, not because they had better swords or more men, but because they had a superior understanding of the human mind, because they were willing to go to places others weren't, because they could make the very idea of victory so psychologically horrifying that the enemy just gave up even when they knew they could win the fight. Let that sink in. Modern military strategists still break down Vlad's campaigns in war colleges all over the world. His use of psychological warfare, scorched earth tactics, and fighting an uneven war have influenced military thinking for centuries, and they still do today. When a hopelessly outmatched force faces an enemy that can crush them, when a straight-up victory is impossible, they still pull pages from Vlad's playbook, starve the enemy of resources, attack their will to fight. Instead of their positions, make them pay in blood for every single inch of ground, and make the cost of winning so mentally unbearable that it feels like losing. These tactics work. History is full of examples proving they work, and that, my friends, is the problem. But using methods like that always comes with a price. Vlad's tactics worked in the short run, but they completely destroyed him in the long run. He became the very thing he was fighting against. The little boy who was tortured by the Ottomans grew up to be a man who perfected their techniques. The prince who wanted to save his people ended up holding them hostage with fear. The great defender of Wallachia died alone and betrayed his head, ending up on a spike in the enemy's capital. So the question isn't, was Vlad evil? Of course he was. That's the easy part. The real question is what his story tells us, about how trauma can curdle into cruelty, about how the tools we use to fight monsters can slowly turn us into monsters ourselves, about how the drive to survive at any cost can get so burned into our DNA that we forget what we were trying to survive for in the first place. Vlad the Impaler lived in a savage time in a land caught between the gears of two giant empires, where staying alive meant you had to be more terrifying than the things that were trying to kill you. And he mastered that dark art better than almost anyone in history. But that mastery cost him everything. He saved Wallachia from being conquered, sure, but what was left when the screaming finally stopped? A nation traumatized, a people terrified of their own savior, and a legacy of blood so deep it would drown out any of his actual achievements. 5 centuries later, we don't remember Vlad for his government reforms, or for defending Christianity, or for his few moments of being a decent ruler. We remember the forest of stakes, the rivers of blood, the calculated cruelty that was so extreme it shocked even the most battle-hardened warriors of his day. We remember him because he held up a dark mirror and showed us exactly what human beings are capable of when fear becomes a weapon, when empathy becomes a liability, and when the only language left to speak is violence. And maybe that's the true horror of Vlad the Impaler. Not that he was a monster, but that he was a man forged by his circumstances, making what he saw as rational choices inside a brutal system using the most effective tools he had to get what he wanted. A man who made the terrible discovery that sometimes the darkest, most evil methods are the ones that actually work, and that knowledge hollowed him out and destroyed him just as surely as any enemy blade ever could. His story doesn't give you any easy answers. It doesn't offer any moral comfort. It just shows you in stark, bloody detail what happens when survival becomes the only thing that matters, when fear is the only currency left, and when humanity itself becomes acceptable collateral damage in the great game of power. And it leaves us with a question to chew on if you were in his shoes, with his past, his enemies, and his options. What would you have done differently? It's an uncomfortable question. But sometimes the uncomfortable questions are the only ones worth asking. That forest of the impaled, it's long gone, now turned to dust centuries ago. The screams have faded into echoes. But the lesson, man, that lesson, is carved into history with blood and terror, power with no checks, fear with no mercy, survival at any human cost. Sure, that stuff might get you a quick win, but you're just planting seeds of your own destruction, seeds that grow into something that will eventually swallow everything whole, especially the person who planted them. You see, Vlad the Impaler wanted to be the hero, the prince who saved his people. Instead, he became the poster boy for cruelty. He craved control, but in the end he couldn't even control himself. He thought fear was the ultimate weapon to crush his enemies, but then fear became the only language he could speak, until it was so deafening that even his own allies were too terrified to let him keep breathing. And that, my friend, is the real tragedy of Vlad Dracula. It wasn't that he was some monster. It's that he was all too human. It wasn't that he failed. It's that he succeeded a little well. It wasn't that his playbook was wrong. It's that it worked perfectly right, up until the moment it catastrophically didn't. And by that point, there was no coming back. The Prince of Wallachia died. In December of 1476, his head sent to Constantinople like some kind of twisted trophy. But the Impaler, that name lives on forever. A ghost story whispered through the ages a haunting reminder of our capacity for calculated cruelty and the terrible, inescapable price you pay for mastering fear itself.